Torres Strait Islander peoples are the first peoples of Australia. The Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation are the traditional owners of the land on which our synagogue is located, for which they have never ceded sovereignty. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present.
Thank you. We really appreciate you doing that, Cheryl. Cheryl, together with Sandy Benjamin, are the co-chairs of our Lifelong Learning Committee here at Temple Beth Israel. To prepare for this evening, I've been reading incessantly from the Times of Israel, from the Jerusalem Post, from a variety of literature, watching any number of YouTube videos, and listening to as many podcasts as I could listen to. But I found a particular article that was written by a colleague by the name of Alan Miller in recognition of Israel's 50th birthday to be of a special interest. And I wanted to share with you some of the things he said about our beloved Israel at that time. He said that Israel, at the conclusion of the 20th century, had begun to fulfill the messianic hopes envisioned by the prophets. At that time, he estimated that Jerusalem had grown from a population in 1876 of 25,000 to more than 500,000, 2/3 of whom were Jewish. Israel has seen to the rebuilding of other devastated cities that now grow rapidly and in effect fulfill the prophecy of Ezekiel, "Thus says the Lord God, when I have cleansed you of your iniquities, I will people your settlements, and the ruined places shall be rebuilt, and the desolate land, after lying waste in the sight of every passerby, shall again be filled." Rabbi Maller, 25 years ago, pointed out that at the beginning of the 20th century, there were 15 to 16 million Jews in the world, with less than 1% living in Israel. Today, there are somewhere between 11 and 13 million Jews in the world, more or less. But some 40% are citizens of Israel. Would it be unreasonable to equate Israel's centrality today with Isaiah's prophecy, in which it's said, "I will bring your folk from the east, I will gather you out of the west, I will say to the south, do not withhold"? Whether we accept the validity of these prophecies, we cannot be laissez-faire about the magnificence of Israel just 75 years on. Israel continues to be a sanctuary for those who are scarred and broken, those who have come on magic carpets or on the wings of eagles from Russia and the Ukraine most recently. All of these returns equally improbable. Israel has succeeded in spite of everything. It has become a greenhouse for Jewish culture, for science, economics, education, spirituality, and Torah. And tonight, we are going to consider this kaleidoscope of interests and concerns, of accomplishment and achievement, as we welcome forward a succession of panelists to present on this Israel at 75. To kick it off, it is my great privilege to welcome forward Rabbi Levi, the estimable Rabbi Levi, who is going to present personal reflections and recollections of the day. Okay. Now, I don't mean to tease the rabbi, but I do want to point out to all of our panelists that Sandy has a system for tracking the time.
Oh, good.
And if you look at the system, when Sandy holds up a sign that says is yellow, that means you have 2 more minutes. Red, You have 30 seconds. Are you prepared to swear to that?
When's Yom Kippur?
Okay. Please welcome Rabbi Levi.
So I want to speak about the Australian background of Israel's creation, because I'm so old, I can remember when it happened in Melbourne. And first of all, a very brief background, and it's terribly brief. In 1929, the Arabs rose against the Jews of what now we call the West Bank, and certainly the Jews of Hebron. And there was a massacre. And Australia, being more British than the British, denied that under British mandate there could have been anything wrong or anything bad happen with the British in charge. Well, there was a headline in the Australian Jewish Herald that came out a few weeks after the massacre at Hebron happened, and it was by a Dr. Rabinoff. I don't suppose anybody remembers Dr. Rabinoff. I can see some heads there. His daughter lives just around the corner here, and he was on his way to England to study postgraduate work, and he wrote back to Newman Rosenthal, the Jewish Herald, and said, "Well, I have seen it. It isn't made up. It's not the Jews inventing a massacre. It happened." And that was a great shock to the Jewish community of Australia, that did see itself as sort of the bastions of the British Empire. Then, of course, we had a very nasty newspaper that was published in Australia called Truth. Some of you will remember Truth. And Truth waged a campaign against Jews leaving Europe and coming specifically to Australia. And they headlined, "We don't want Jewish refugees." In 1938, the government very generously allowed 8 Jewish doctors or dentists from Central Europe to migrate to Australia. The medical and the dental association in Australia were dead set against it, and they lobbied hard, and so many people were skilled people were condemned to death. And the government finally gave in, and 8 Jewish doctors or dentists chosen by ballot could migrate to Australia. 8. Mind you, that was better than New Zealand. There was a conference in Evian next to Switzerland, and they discussed who could take which group of persecuted Jews from Central Europe. The Australian delegate came with orders from Lord Bruce, who was in London, but he had been Prime Minister here. He was representing Australia, and he was pro-Jewish, and he said we could take 7,000 refugees from Central Europe every year. In event, the nasty little man, who was the Minister for Immigration and was representing Australia at Evian, cut it down to 3,500 a year, and that was generous. It happened to be the biggest allocation of refugees, Jewish refugees, in the world. Nobody did any better. Terrible. And then we had a magazine called The Bulletin, and that was, of course, the expression of Australianism from 1900 to 1940-50, and The Bulletin waged a campaign against Jews and loved having cartoons by the Lindsays about Jews with big noses, etc. And then we had the very nice man, excellent man, who was a member of the Anglican Synod, and his name was Eric D. Butler, and he lived out in Eltham. And he had a thing about Jews. He actually ended up in internment camp for a while, and he wrote a book published in Australia, price 2 shillings and 6pence, The International Jew, The Truth About the Protocols of Zion. So you'd be very interested to know that we rule the world, and there are some elements of that still when you read AJAC and the bulletins, their summary of what's been going on. But in 1938, 1939, 40, it was devastating because there was no Jewish state. Billy Hughes, Sir Otto Niemeyer's report on world finance, an anti-Semitic pamphlet, nasty. Or here's another one by Eric Butler, The Red Pattern of World Conquest. And after the war, Butler proved that Churchill was a stooge of Hitler. You can't help it. And then there were our own problems. We had the first Jewish Governor General, who couldn't have been more different to the second. And Sir Isaac Isaacs, distinguished jurist, loved the empire, and he was finally brought to book by a younger professor of law, international law at New South Wales, Professor Julius Stone, who wrote an extraordinary pamphlet which said to the Jews of Australia, stand up and be counted. Well, we thought, oh, can't do that. Anyway, so just to depress yourself. Anyway, so finally Australia began very tentatively to have its own foreign policy. And the person who exemplified that in the most was Dr. Herbert V. Everett, who went to New York, Lake Success, and recalled how the Jewish state came into being in 1947. He wrote, it was a long business. This is an Australian writing, not mirroring the Foreign Office in Whitehall or in London. This was Australia. It was a long business. It took more than 3 months. We had all the voices prophesying no decision, that nothing would be done, but they rather made us mistake in that, as far as Australia was concerned, and I was concerned, I was acting in the fullest accord with Mr. Chifley, the Prime Minister. We were determined to make the United Nations face up to its responsibility to come to a decision. There would have been no United Nations decision, there would have been no Israel if we had not fought the establishment of the state. So Australia holds a special role in Jewish history, and we should be aware of that. I won't go into some of the other horrible things that are there, but I will defy my 2 minutes by sharing with you the things that I cut out at the age of 14, which concerned the creation of the state. And I hoped that everybody here would have a copy of this, but as usual, anything you plan goes wrong, and this was one of them. So these are available. You may not believe it, but, and I'm not going to read them all, but I'm going to say. The first one, when I was in 1947, 11th of October, suddenly there were headlines about Palestine and Jews in Australia. And here in the Sun, the headline is, armies of 5 Arab nations are moving to defend Palestine from Zionism. The Associated Press reported this. Troops are starting to move at midnight and manoeuvring near the Palestine border. The Lebanese press reports unofficially that troops of King Abdullah's Arab Legion, which happened to be, the officers all happened to be, mostly were British, the officers of the King Abdullah's Arab Legion of Transjordan, best equipped native force in the Middle East, are massing along the River Jordan. And they carved out a slice of Palestine, eventually. Next cutting, which takes place in May,
John, we're going to have to finish.
hysteria sweeps holy city. Roads blocked. Run for money as the British leave. Funny, isn't it? Run for money. That's what Jews do. This is the sun. And the date is the 29th of April. Or, on the same day, fearful hysteria is sweeping all of Palestine. Because Jews get hysterical, you know. On the 15th of May, pretty familiar date, I hope, with you. 15th of May, the headline is Open War, Armies Strike, as Jews name new territory. The Arab-Jewish battle for Palestine began today, which was a bit of a lie, as the last British troops were evacuating the country, which is also not correct. The Arabs are reported to have seized 4 Jewish settlements south of Jerusalem, killing, wounding, or capturing 750 Jews. And that's the Etzion block, and that was a major defeat. But beside all this, it says, forever, Jewish state, Israel. That's the first we knew about it. And Jewish leaders in a solemn ceremony this afternoon proclaimed the Jewish state of Israel. Next day, Arab armies are advancing steadily into Palestine. Gaza, 40 miles inside the Palestinian frontier, has been captured. That sounds terrible, doesn't it? Except everybody in Gaza is Arab. Anyway, and an all-Arab town of Acre in the north is besieged by the Jews. And there's a report of the Jewish struggle for Jerusalem. 18th of May, 4 Arab states have decided to open hostilities against the Jews in Palestine. The Transjordan government, that lovely, which now has a peace treaty with Israel, has declared war on Zionism. And the Transjordanian troops have already occupied Jericho on the road from Amman. No explanation that Jericho was an Arab town. Arabs capture Jerusalem, 29th of May. 11-day fight ends, all Jews to go. And finally, you'll be glad to hear, 7th of June, 1948. Here I was sitting in Melbourne, and suddenly, in the newspaper is a headline, Jews holding state against Arabs, by Douglas Brass, special correspondent of the Herald, arrived in Tel Aviv from London. And he writes, Israel is intact. That is the first clear fact hitting anybody coming here from an outside world, which tends to believe that the Arabs have almost made a kill. Israel is intact from north to south and is improving its lines. Its spirit and morale are deeply impressive, even slightly hysterical, slightly terrifying. And the last piece of information I'll share with you, in June, 7th of June, the headline is, it's about time somebody said to the Americans, come on, gentlemen, behave yourselves. Don't let the Palestine issue split us. Exercise restraint, give up abuse and calumny. When the New York Post calls Britain a malignant cancer among nations, it's demeaning to us and so on. Protest against hysterical, word again, Zionism in USA. So that's the background. The background in Australia, a very interesting one, and we could spend a whole evening talking about it, but we can't because they'll kill me.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi, very much for helping to set the scene for us in 1948 on 5ER, May 15th, 1948. Our next speaker is Joel Burney, the Executive Manager at the Australia-Israel Jewish Affairs Council. I'm not going to take a great deal of time in addition to tell the group a little bit about you, but rather give you the opportunity to get started straight away. Thank you and welcome.
Hopefully you can hear me. Okay. I'm Joel. Thank you so much for having me tonight. I have technically 8 minutes that can be stretched potentially to 10 minutes, but I'm going to try and keep it to under that if we can. So you can all hear me. I'm going to get into it. I'm going to speak quickly but clearly, okay? Just because it's quick doesn't mean it's unclear. So I'm going to try to be quick but clear. The second thing is that my topic tonight is Israeli politics. So congratulations on Israel's birthday at 75th. It's not the most interesting of topics to cover. However, I'm going to try very hard to make it as interesting as possible. All right, so you ready with me? I've got a stopwatch here, Sandy, so we're all going to be good, okay? I'm going to divide the past 75 years of Israeli politics into 4 segments of 2 minutes, okay? So we're going to go quickly but clearly. So the first period that we're going to cover is the Labour golden years, 1948 to 1977. So for nearly 3 decades of Israel's first 3 decades, you've got the Labour Party dominance. Well, the precursors to the Labour Party, which was the Mapai Party and the Alignment Party, led by founders of the state, David Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir, Yitzhak Rabin, Shimon Peres, Levi Eshkol, these established, well-known leaders of the Zionist project. Important to note that the factions that established Israel in 1948 existed before the state. They were political factions inside the Jewish Agency, the pre-state, if you will. And those factions still exist at the World Zionist Organization today. So the World Zionist Organization met again in Jerusalem maybe 6 or 7 weeks ago. Those pre-state factions still exist today, and they are represented in the mainstream political parties in Israel. So from 1948 to 1977, for nearly 30 years, dominated by the Labour Party or by the political left, did tremendous things within those 3 decades. Israel faced tremendous hardship, not just on the geopolitical front, on whether or not that they would continue to exist through Arab aggression of their neighbours, which was far worse during those first 3 decades than what we've had recently. But realistically, apart from that and economic devastation building the state, they also had terrible issues with famine, with food, with poor economics. They made it work. And for the first 30 years, they did a fantastic job. Okay? So that's the first period that we'll see here. 30 years, well, close to 3 decades dominated by the Labour, or the precursors to the Labour Party, the Mapai Party and the Alignment Party. Now, in 1977, something happens. So, in actual fact, if you look at the history, Yitzhak Rabin was the Prime Minister in 1977. He was the last Labour Prime Minister of that era. He had to resign, and some of you will remember, he had to resign because he had an overseas bank account. He was previously the ambassador to the United States, and while he was there, he and his wife had a bank account. They didn't close it when they came back. That was illegal. And because of that, he resigned. Now, what's interesting is that he resigned during the campaign, not before Parliament was dissolved. So his resignation did not dissolve Parliament. He resigned during the campaign, and Shimon Peres took over. Now, it's important to note that Menachem Begin wins in 1977. So the first time that Likud wins the election from Labour is in 1977. And from that point on, we go to stage 2. And the stage 2 is sort of what I call a 2-party system, the toing and froing between Labour and Likud. So over those periods between 1977 and around 2001, you have alternating periods of Labour prime ministership and Likud prime ministerships, and it alternates. However, one thing needs to be very, very clear. Labour has only been in power for 8 years after they lost in 1977. So from 1977 until now, Labour has only been in power for 8 of those years, which is just an interesting tidbit So within the period of 1977 to 2001, two-party system. Sometimes it's Likud, sometimes it's Labour, sometimes it's both of them, like with the power sharing agreement that Yitzhak Shamir had as Likud and what Shimon Peres had as Labour. Interestingly, another differentiating factor between the two parties is that since the establishment of Likud, Likud has only ever had 4 leaders. So for a party that was established many, many decades ago, it has only had 4 leaders, namely Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Shamir, Ariel Sharon, and Benjamin Netanyahu. So that period, again, between 1977 and 2001, even though it alternated between prime ministers of Likud and Labour, it was realistically dominated by Likud prime ministers. And then afterwards, in 2001 until 2021, which is the third period within the 2-minute slots that I'll talk about, we have a real consolidation of power on the right. So from that time, it's dominated by prime ministers on the right. Well, some would claim the centre, but we're talking about centrist prime ministers of Ariel Sharon and Ehud Olmert. But then you have nearly 10 years of, a very long time of sustained premiership by Benjamin Netanyahu. A real consolidation and a real illustration of not only the shift in the political spectrum inside Israel. It's not just a simple right and left shift. The centre changed composition and changed size and also changed its alignment on the spectrum. But what it also illustrates is, and for reasons that we can get into later, because I'm not rich for time, is the essential slow and painful death of the well-established traditional Labour Party, which from 2001 onwards has never been able to really successfully challenge for electoral dominance. There was one brief period during that time under the current president's leadership with Bougie Herzog, with Yitzhak Herzog, as what was called the Zionist Union. They held 24 seats together, but that was a long time ago. Now Labour holds 4 seats in the current Knesset, and it is challenging for them to reach the electoral threshold that is required for them to continue. Now we enter the 2001 onward zone, which is a zone which I don't really know how to label because it's very confusing. But if I had to give a label, I could say the right and left is an easy way to a simplistic, superficial, but an okay way of describing what's happened over the past, say, 73 years, but what's happened in the past 2 years is an illustration of a change, and that change is the Bibi no Bibi change. So it ceased to be about right versus left and became coalitions that were in favor of Benjamin Netanyahu or those that were against him. And those that were against him included right-wing parties. That's why the right-left divide doesn't really work very well in this scenario. And what we've seen is that we've seen the previous government of Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid, which was very interesting in its composition. It had elements of the left, including the Alliance of Meretz and Labour. It had elements of the right, with Gideon Sa'ar's Justice Party and Avigdor Lieberman's Israel Beiteinu, but it also had an Islamist party in there, the Ra'am party was also there. So it was an interesting coalition, and that the glue that bound that coalition was not ideology on the right or left spectrum, it was their mutual dislike of Benjamin Netanyahu. And now this current government that we have here are all those that were on the other side of that ledger that were willing to participate in a government that was led by the current Prime Minister. And so in this current phase that we have here, it is different from the other 3 phases that I described. And it is playing itself out now in real time as we're watching. And I think at this stage it's too easy to tell as to what current phase is and how it's going to end, right? As the traditional right and left barriers dissolve and the spectrum becomes a little bit interesting. Because currently now you have Benjamin Netanyahu as the most left part of his current governing coalition. Whereas traditionally when he governed from the centre. He had parties on the left of him, he had parties on the right of him. Now he has only parties on the right of him. So that there is no doubt, for good or bad, that the current composition of the current government is different from what they've had before. As to what happens in the next election, or whether or not there is a majority that results from that election, and whether or not they have to go to a subsequent election and then a subsequent election, who knows? Only time will tell. That's my time. Mazel tov on 75 great years. I hope that I wasn't too quick. I hope I remained clear, and I hope I was at least semi-entertaining. So thank you very much.
Nice little tap.
Ido, you're ready for my slideshow.
Thank you very much, Joel. I'm going to be presenting a bird's eye view at the development of progressive and Reform Judaism's view of Israel and Zionism, all in 4 minutes before yielding to a short video for the balance of my time. How we doing? Beautiful. And, oops. To escape and go back to first one. Did you go out of the program? Okay. Let's go back to number 1. That's it. And reading view. Beautiful. Okay. So, as many of you may be aware, the Reform or Progressive movement has had a succession of platform statements through the years, the first of which is from 1845, some 35 years approximately after the founding of the Reform movement. And there, amongst other things said about the length of the service, the vernacular of the service, and the priestly and dietary concerns, is that the hope for a national restoration contradicts our feeling for the fatherland, for Germany. Our nationality is now only expressed in religious concepts and institutions. This by a Rabbi Samuel Holdheim. So there were already a certain amount of movement in Europe at this time in favor of a Zionist response to the anti-Semitism with which Jews were contending. But at this time, there was no movement at the station so far as German Reform Jews were concerned. Thank you. Next slide. In 1937, in Pittsburgh, as part of the Pittsburgh Platform, in the years after the Nazis had come to power, but before, if you will, the final solution, the Reform movement meeting in Pittsburgh issued a statement with respect to Zionism. We affirm the obligation of all Jewry to aid in its upbuilding as a Jewish homeland by endeavoring to make of it not only a haven of refuge for the oppressed, but also a center of Jewish culture and spiritual life. What's missing, I think, and you may agree, is a very clear statement in support of the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Yisrael. Thank you. In 1976, a centenary perspective is issued that says something which I think bears a very different tone. We have both a stake and a responsibility in building the state of Israel, assuring its security, defining its Jewish character. We encourage Aliyah to those who wish to find maximum personal fulfillment in the cause of Zion. We demand that Reform Judaism be unconditionally legitimized in the state of Israel. And it should be noted that those of you who have traveled to Jerusalem and may have visited the campus of the Hebrew Union College at 13 King David Street know that that campus was opened already 3 years prior and reflected one of the most important statements of loyalty and concern for the Reform movement and in Israel. Thank you. Finally, in 1999, it says, we are committed to Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel, and rejoice in its accomplishments. We affirm the unique qualities of living in Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, and encourage Aliyah, immigration to Israel. We are committed to a vision of the state of Israel that promotes a full civil, human, and religious rights for all its inhabitants, an echo of the Document of Independence, and that strives for a lasting peace between Israel and its neighbors. So you may see, even in this short time, a distinct evolution of thought with respect to Reform Judaism and the state of Israel. Now I would like to take you to a short film that was put together by the Israel Movement for Progressive Judaism in 2021. And I'm not trying to raise any money tonight, but I want you to meet some of the people involved in today's Israel Movement for Progressive Judaism and to celebrate together with us the enormous growth and sense of confidence that the progressive movement in Israel exudes.
This report will show our work over the past 2 years.
Both the first two speakers have been to Melbourne in the last year.
During the years of COVID. This is an opportunity for us to grow.
At the start of 2020, mere weeks before COVID hit, IMPJ's new media department completed a major digital upgrade, allowing us to seamlessly transition our programs in congregational life to the virtual world. Even after in-person activities have resumed, 80% continue to enjoy Reformed Jewish content. In the last decade alone, IMPJ has doubled its presence to 54 congregations across Israel. Many of these were established in peripheral and agricultural regions who have no local access to pluralistic Jewish life, until now. Over the past 2 years, the IMPJ led 3,000 Benot and Bnei Mitzvah ceremonies, 1,500 egalitarian weddings, close to 400 Reform conversions, and 500 funeral ceremonies. IMPJ believes in the power of youth and young adults to become the next leaders of Israel. Noor Telem, IMPJ's youth movement, has grown to hundreds of children in 13 locations. Our young leaders are trained through our new Shimshim Year of Service program, through IMPJ's pre-IDF Mechina, and later post-IDF in our Plamid young adult communities. IMPJ's education department develops pluralistic Jewish curriculum for the Israeli classroom, brings Reform rabbis to teach holiday workshops in secular Israeli schools, and twins classrooms in North America and Israel with Yachdav. The Domina Light program partners IMPJ congregations with Reform congregations around the world to build bridges, share, and develop our connection to Jewish peoplehood. The Israel Religious Action Center is the legal aid and public advocacy branch of the IMPJ. IRAC works to advance freedom of and from religion, ensure equal status for pluralistic streams, and promote equality in public. Their work continues to combat hate speech, racism, and discrimination, secure equal rights for LGBTQ individuals seeking to adopt, provide legal aid to immigrants, including refugees from the war in Ukraine, and much more. Among the IMPJ's 54 congregations across Israel are 2 that provide Jewish community life to Russian and Ukrainian speakers in their native language. Since the war in Ukraine broke out, hundreds of refugees and Olim who have escaped the war zone have joined these congregations, benefiting from special absorption activities, Jewish life, pastoral counseling, and spiritual solace that has helped them both to heal and build a new home in Israel. Keren Mekavod is the humanitarian and social responsibility branch of the IMPJ, active in various areas across Israel. Keren Mekavod provides aid to families in need from all denominations and runs programs that empower marginalized communities of all Israeli society. Over the past years, our budget has grown by over 20%, reflecting the growth of our activity.
Thank you. Thank you. So, with great brevity, what I wanted to demonstrate was simply how a movement which kept Zionism at an arm's length originally has grown to be a powerful force, a vital enterprise within the Jewish state in areas as traditional as Torah, Avodah, and Ma'asim Tovim. And I want to impress upon each of you to consider how you can connect through the arms of the progressive movement with the people in the state of Israel through Artza and in so many other ways. Some of you may wish to to enlarge your celebration of the 75th birthday by making a trip to Israel with Jocelyn and I on the 29th of October this year. I'm very proud to have spent my first year in rabbinical school in Jerusalem, the first year of our marriage in Jerusalem, and are grateful for the efforts made by Anna, Yair, and all of the others who are playing such an instrumental role in making Israel a more just, a country that enjoys better equality and opportunity for all types of Jews. For as it says, there is more than one way to be Jewish. Okay, how'd I do, Sandy?
You're late.
I'm late? I can't believe it. Okay. All right. With that reprimand, I want to take the opportunity to introduce Rabbah Dr. Melanie Landau. Born and bred here in Melbourne, some of you may know her, and living in Jerusalem for the last 12 years. For 8 years, until COVID-19, she worked as the Director of Facilitation for Encounter, which also involved taking influential Jewish leaders to listen to Palestinians. Prior to that, she was a lecturer at Monash University and co-founder of Darshani Community Learning Program. Currently, she runs a private therapy practice with individuals and couples based on differentiation with a trauma-informed and somatic focus. She is currently training in family therapy. It's my pleasure to have Melanie join us from her home in Israel to talk on the subject of Israel and the Palestinians.
Thank you very much, Rabbi, for that introduction. And hello, everyone there. And thank you, Sandy Benjamin, also for the invitation to speak. I see my love towards Israel being an authentic love that's not afraid to touch the hard places, a robust love, a love I can trust. I want to share some of my experiences and reflections of taking Jews to listen to Palestinians in the West Bank. The main themes that I want to cover, some great challenges that lie ahead, include 1, allowing the fullness of the grief of the wars and the death and the injury that has already occurred. Number 2, the acknowledgement that Palestinians have incurred great losses and continue to do so, but without questioning the legitimacy of Israel. And thirdly, finding ways to connect to the humanity of the other beyond the headlines and beyond polarisation. So about the fullness of grief. As you're probably familiar, there's an intensity about the way Israel commemorates and celebrates its national days. From the grief and sadness of Yom HaZikaron, the day commemorating those who have died in the army, in wars and terror, the country moves the next day into the elation and jubilation of Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel Independence Day. And it was night and it was day. The Jewish day starts the night before. On Yom HaZikaron, the main message in traditional ceremonies is about both the tragedy of loss and at the same time the inevitability of the conflict and commiserating that this is our fate. An island in a sea of hostility, and also the hostility within our still undefined borders. In contrast, alternative joint ceremonies that can be seen as somewhat controversial, conducted by Combatants for Peace and also the Bereaved Parent Circle Family Forum, mark the death of both Jews and Palestinians in the conflict and the tragedy of it, while also using this tragedy as the basis of being unwilling to accept that things have to be this way. These people who have paid the highest possible price of the conflict are unwilling to use the conflict to further alienate both people from each other and to refuse to further polarise the conversation. They try to use their greatest loss as the impetus to create a society where no person should have to suffer the greatest loss that they've suffered. So, and as I said, these joint ceremonies are quite controversial because it's usually such a delicate national and particularistic time, and also with so much personal grief. In his magnificent work, The Smell of Rain on Dust, Martin Prechtel speaks about the dire effects of insufficient grieving. His take on things is that it's insufficient grieving that causes us to think that war is inevitable. Politicising loss and speaking from the head up is not grief. Grief is an embodied right, that as we go through it, we are continually transformed. This is what Prechtel said. All of these ungrieved situations continue ungrieved, and therefore psychologically, the destruction of war never ends for the people. All the people and places lost are buried in a shallow mental mass grave of temporary amnesia in the collective mind. Temporarily out of sight, this does nothing to metabolise the immensity of any of war's losses and nothing to return the people back to a life without the prospect of another war always looming. If we haven't lived or lost enough, or we have anaesthetised ourselves away from it, or enjoyed the lazy comfort of victim status, then we cannot praise. If the way we live does not praise life, then we are not alive. There is always something amazing everywhere. It's in our seeing that makes everywhere the place that a personal revolution of praise and grief can take place. I love living in Jerusalem. I feel privileged to be here and to live my life here. I became a permanent resident, like East Jerusalem Palestinians, who they're not Israeli citizens, but they're permanent residents. My daughter, Katoret, she made Aliyah and a few months ago finished serving in the army. She now lives in the Golan Heights on kibbutz with her boyfriend and works at a local vineyard. On their stairwell is a sticker, agriculture will prevail. Haklaut Tenatzeach. My son's not planning to become a citizen or serve in the army, but hopes to start a preparatory course, Mechina, at Hebrew University in October. His girlfriend is currently in officers training for intelligence, and we're going to visit her later today in the West Bank, as she does some security roster for a Jewish community over the Green Line. Acknowledging the original loss. When I came here 12 years ago, I started working in the conflict, taking influential Jewish leaders to listen to Palestinians in the West Bank. It was incredible to freely move between borders. One of my colleagues, a beloved New York rabbi who joined our trip and went on to serve as an alumni facilitator for several trips, said that when he heard what Palestinians were saying about their experience, he felt a similar experience to when he first learned about biblical scholarship and cracks in divine authorship of the Bible. Something like the carpet on which he was standing fell from under him, just like that. Here's the thing. So basically, there's 5 million Palestinians in Israel and the West Bank who are not going anywhere, and Israel needs to work out a way to have peace and security within this reality. 2 million of those Palestinians are in Israel, and sometimes they're called Arab Israelis, but many of them have now reclaimed the name Palestinian. And there's also Palestinians in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank under different degrees of Israeli military organisation, and also in Palestinian Area A, which is fully governed by Palestinians, as well as also Palestinians who just find themselves as refugees, and that status gets passed on. So basically, I think that even for us as Jews in Israel, it's really important that Israel and the Jewish people acknowledge the loss suffered by Palestinians in the growth, in the creation and growth of Israel. It doesn't mean that Israel is delegitimized, but it just means that there's a real loss. It's also understandable that we have fear of acknowledging this loss. I've spoken to Israelis who say that if you acknowledge the loss, then that makes your claim to the land weaker. But I don't agree, and I think it also makes you stronger. It's impossible to deny that there are Palestinians from villages that no longer exist. There's a halachic concept called migo, which means that when you admit something you didn't need to admit, then you are believed. It's like you get credit in the believability stakes from acknowledging something that you didn't have to. The humanness of the other. One of the incredible things about the work I did was the privilege to meet with incredibly inspiring people, both Jewish leaders who are willing to let themselves be very uncomfortable, and also a range of Palestinian civil society leaders. One story out of many that I want to share with you, and then I'll finish with with that story, comes from my friend Lama, who comes from Dura near Hebron. Lama is a teacher. Once she put on her board a poem translated into Arabic, and then she read it to the students. They thought it was an amazing poem, and then she told them it was written by an Israeli. They were shocked. What? An Israeli writes poetry? That's just really makes me sad to hear that. The poem Jerusalem was written by Yehuda Amichai. The experience of some Palestinians with Israelis is only with people with guns in uniform. These may be our children, they are also my children. But for Palestinians, this is not a good recipe for future relationship with Israelis. In addition, the associations that some Palestinians have with Kippot and Tzitzit is about people taking over their land and acts of random violence. In a similar way that many Jewish Israelis associate Palestinians with violence. All of this is happening and does not allow for internalising the humanness of the other. This is a deep concern. It's not only about Jews and Palestinians. In recent internal turmoil, polarisation has risen so high that people with other opinions are dehumanised. We saw where this can lead with the murder of Rabin those years ago. Internalising the humanness of the other is not about agreeing with them, but about realising that they are more similar to us than they are different. This has implications for how we think about the future. I look forward to further discussing these issues with my panellists, and I thank you for the opportunity to participate in this 75th celebration. I'm just going to finish my remarks with the poem that Lama shared with her class. This is Jerusalem by Yehuda Amichai. On a roof in the old city, laundry hanging in the late afternoon sunlight, the white sheet of a woman who is my enemy, the towel of a man who is my enemy, to wipe off the sweat of his brow. In the sky of the old city, a kite. At the other end of the string, a child I can't see because of the wall. We have put up many flags. They have put up many flags to make us think they're happy, to make them think we're happy. Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you very, very much, Melanie. We appreciate you getting up early and being with us this evening here in Melbourne. Some of you will have noticed that I've been on my phone a bit. I'm not checking the stock market nor the sports scores. I am, however, writing comments and registering thoughts and questions as the speakers go along, and I would encourage you, if you wish, if your memory is anything like mine, to maybe make some notes as you go along, because in just a few minutes, you'll have a chance to put your questions to our panelists, and we'll talk about that more when we get there. Now it's my great pleasure to welcome Marcus Mandy to present to us, the Chief Executive Officer of the Australia-Israel Chamber of Commerce here in Victoria. Marcus engages both private and public sector to promote trade and facilitate investment between Israel and Australia. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Thank you very much, Rabbi. It's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation, Sandy. And I was reflecting, I think it's the last time I shared a lectern with Rabbi Levi was for my bar mitzvah, so it makes this evening even more special. Great to see. As the Rabbi said, the objective of the Australia-Israel Chamber of Commerce is the promotion of trade between Australia and Israel. In the Australian context, it was established in Melbourne in 1954 in its original form, and its objective was to help Israeli exports, to promote Israeli products in Australia, and to invite members of the Jewish community that were involved in business to engage with Israel. We have now offices today. We're a federal organisation, so we have offices in Perth, in Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, and the jewel in the crown is our office in Tel Aviv, our sister chamber we call it, but very much work hand and in hand. Some of you may be familiar with our regular lunches and event series, but today I'm really going to be talking about the trade delegations and then how it relates to Israel's economy and the high tech, and go a little bit to the beginning as well. So 20 years ago, the Chamber probably would have hosted one delegation a year to Israel or two delegations a year to Israel. This year, we're expecting 30 business delegations to Israel, just this year. And these delegations involve different business organisations essentially, but it might be not-for-profits as well. It might be academia, science institutes, any organisation or people where we think there can be collaboration between the two countries. And given Israel's prowess in high technology, these days the themes are around business around AI, cybersecurity, solving problems, big data. Themes might be clean tech, med tech, customer experience, 3D printing, agri-tech, water tech. So we look at all the different industry sectors and invite companies from all around Australia to come with us to Israel. The other interesting aspect is that our Israel office is now helping Australian companies which were never before engaged with Israel. So, for example, the mining industry in Australia never had really an interest in doing business with Israel, and now they're very much engaged with Israel, looking at technologies, again, around digitalisation, more efficiency, cybersecurity, protection, all of that sort of thing. So when we talk about Israel's economy, and we're taking the groups to Israel, it's really to explore the high-tech ecosystem. It's worth noting that the high-tech in Israel is generating around 18% of Israel's GDP. It's responsible for around 50% of Israel's exports in goods and services. Last year, goods and services in Israel was estimated at $166 billion. So you can see it's a significant contribution. And it's also employing over 10% of the workforce. Now, despite the geopolitical uncertainties in the region, despite the economic uncertainties that have been happening in recent years, Israel's economy grew 6.5% last year, and The Economist ranked Israel as the fourth best economy in the OECD last year. Contributing to the ecosystem is the vast number of multinationals that have R&D centres in Israel. There's now over 400, so think of all the Googles, your AWSs, Microsofts, etc. They're employing a lot of people and contributing a lot to the economy in terms of higher wages, in terms of exports, and in terms of employment. And Israel is now ranked in the top 20 countries in the world for GDP per capita. So how times have changed and what an economic miracle it is today compared to if we go back to the very beginning. So I might just jump there. And I discovered an interesting article which was in 1951 titled "The Facts About Australia's Trade with Israel During 1950 to 1951" by Mr. Kay Campbell from the Trade Policy Division of the Australian Department of Commerce and Agriculture. And there he explains that in the 48 and 49 there really wasn't much trade between Australia and Israel whilst the war was going on, but towards the end of 49 and the beginning of 1950, trade started to come back, not as much as it was pre this declaration of Israel, but nonetheless. And to give you an idea of the different times, Israel had austerity measures. They lacked foreign reserves to purchase really basic imports. It was really a poor country. And at that time, Australia only exported to Israel, and Israel would only accept essential food items such as cheese, powdered milk, margarine, and canned meats and canned fruit. The other articles that Israel accepted from Australia was wool and leather, which were important for the developing textile trade. On the other hand, Israel, its first exports to Australia were diamonds, potash, which was used in fertiliser, and false teeth. So I found this really interesting. So today, Israel is a world leader in artificial intelligence, but back in the 1950s, they were a world leader in artificial teeth. It's actually a whole different side story, which I don't have time for now, but it's really fascinating. And then obviously Israel's economy started to do with the agriculture, so Jaffa oranges and Gotek swimwear later in the 50s then became bigger trades. But going back again to this report, Mr. Campbell wrote, and this is his take on Israel at the time, "The rate of industrial expansion during the past 2 years has been remarkable, and already Israel has become the leading industrial country of the Middle East. This is being achieved in spite of the fact that the rate of investment from American and other countries, although steady, has proved inadequate in relation to the volume of labour, so all the immigrants coming in, and technological skill which is offering." He continued on, Every incentive is now being offered to the investor to induce him to place his capital in local industries, particularly the export industries, which is a matter of policy the government is committed to foster. The Israel government is fully aware that in the short term, it cannot, without financial assistance, obtain sufficient imports of food to sustain the growing community, and the country must literally export or die. So right from the very beginning, we see the importance of why Israel is such a strong exporter, always focusing on the world markets, obviously not trading with its neighbours. And the other interesting things, no natural resources, the necessity to trade, skilled workforce, importance of foreign assistance and foreign capital, and again, that strong export focus. Rabbi mentioned about all the different podcasts, and I've been enjoying one, which is the Israel Story. I don't know if anyone's been listening to that, which contacted the closest living survivors of the 37 people that signed Israel's Declaration of Independence, so grandchildren or nieces, nephews, etc. And there was one interview which they interviewed David Remetz, who was Israel's first transport minister, and he was asked, and it was all in Hebrew, but they translated, and he was asked, what do you think makes Israel special? So this is 1951. And I think he was more talking about the country rather than the economics as such, but he said for him that the source of Israel's strength lay in Torah, in science, and in knowledge. And I think, to me, that's really special because obviously the Jewish state is in Torah, but the science and knowledge is really the bedrock of Israel's success in its economy. And people think the high tech, but really the underneath pin is this science and knowledge. And then jumping quickly to 1967, Israel really found it had to be self-sufficient in defence, so created its own manufacturing and defence industries in electronics, telecommunications, aviations, and that was also the bedrock of Israel's high tech, the deep technology. And then towards the end of the 1969, government officials then start to ask this question, how can knowledge be turned into economic value? So going back to this again, we value science, we value knowledge, but how can we turn this into economic value? And that was actually the origins of then the establishment in Israel of the offices of chief scientists. And this was very special for Israel that they devoted, firstly it was for the defence, so the Defence Ministry had its own chief scientist and devoted R&D in defence, but then it moved on to other ministries. So the Ministry of Industry had their own chief scientist, and these chief scientists actually had budget, and they were able to invest in R&D and invest in R&D for industrial purposes, which maybe the commercial world found a little bit too risky, but the government of the day thought that this was important. And this office of the chief scientist is now called the Israel Innovation Authority, and they have a big budget, and some of it's actually debated in current politics, but in terms of their budget was slightly cut, and the high-tech community not happy about that. But nonetheless, going back to the office of the chief scientist, this was important in establishing infrastructure and community between government, academia, and industry. Industry have problems, academia can help, and government can connect. And there was a whole lot of government policies around also linking industry and academia, but also then it became international agreements between the US and Israel and other countries around industrial cooperation, and eventually it came into the venture capital market for Israel in the 90s. Through the Office of the Chief Scientist, Israel invested $1 in $3 into venture capital, and that was sort of what started Israel's successful venture capital industry and international venture capital coming to Israel. I don't have time to mention a lot of other reforms, privatisations, floating shekels, capital markets, but that all led to it. And today we see Israel has the highest gross domestic expenditure on R&D as a percentage of GDP in the OECD at 5.4%. Another thing that we used to say, Israel has no natural resources. Well, today they do. Israel has natural gas resources off the coast. And this means Israel now has energy security, but more than that, it has, in a way, economic peace opportunities. So with supplying gas to its neighbours in Egypt and Jordan, Israel's actually announced they're extracting more gas and providing more to Egypt, and Egypt are refining it in their LNG, and they're selling that on to Europe. And also there's talks Israel's going to do something similar with Cyprus. And finally, as we know, we've read the Abraham Accords. The Gulf states are partnering with Israel now for prosperity, for economic prosperity, maybe also security, but economic prosperity as well is in the mix. UAE signed a full trade agreement with Israel last year. Saudi Arabia and Sudan have opened their airspace to all planes to and from Israel, reducing flight times dramatically. So when we think from Melbourne, the Victorian Minister was in Israel earlier in March, met with El Al, Victoria and El Al signed an understanding that their objective is to get direct flights between Tel Aviv and Melbourne by June next year, which will be exciting. So that'll cut down on travel time. And then the other thing I was going to say is in terms of Israel's prosperity, Israel's a relatively young country. Life expectancy at birth is among the highest in the world. So although there might always be some uncertainties in the economic conditions, on the whole, Israel's economic prosperity and economic future is looking good. Thank you.
An amazing and optimistic report, isn't it? And not a single reference to the startup nation. There's so much more than that.
Yeah.
So much more. Kol hakavod. Our very last panelist tonight is Kylie Eisman-Lifshitz, a graduate of Sydney University Law School, practicing law as an intellectual property lawyer for several years, working with Israeli high-tech companies at the established Israeli firm of Shimron, Malcho, Persky and Company. Kylie has joined in 2004 the JDC's International Relations Division, where she served as a senior associate, working with donors and foundations, representing JDC's humanitarian operations in over 70 countries around the world. She is now in Jerusalem, working as an intellectual property lawyer and board member of Mavoy Satum. I hope she'll tell us a little bit about that, a nonprofit that assists agunot and mesurevot, get women who have been denied a Jewish divorce. So this promises to be a very interesting presentation. Please let us welcome her with a round of applause.
You're on mute.
He's muted.
That's better.
תן רגע, לא יכול להשמיע. יופי.
Yay. Can you hear me now? Can someone wave?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yay, okay, great. Is it possible to switch the camera so I can see the audience? I know that sounds like a crazy request, but I'm looking at the beamer. Yes, hello everyone. So nice to see you all. Thank you for coming out and for coming to hear everything about Israel. And having grown up in Australia, I know it's a community that has a very soft spot for Israel. It's incredibly dedicated, and I think it's very meaningful to us that you take the time to come out and hear what's going on here in Israel. As an Australian who lives in Jerusalem, I've been living here for now 25 years. I've made it my passion and my focus to deal with women's rights, and specifically women's divorce rights in Israel. As was kindly mentioned in the introduction, I'm actually no longer a lawyer. Like many people who are lawyers, I moved on to social justice issues. I worked for many years in the Joint, and now I'm an organizational consultant, and I do a lot of work around social change. I'm the CEO and founder of WorkWell. In any case, what I do in my spare time is I chair Mavoy Satum. Mavoy Satum was founded in 1995, actually, by a 90-year-old woman, if you can believe it, who's heard the stories of these women time and again, and they're really horror stories, women entrapped in marriage in horrible circumstances, and founded this organization. So it's really never too late to change the world.
Anyway, it's my privilege to walk in her footsteps, and the work that we do essentially focuses on the rights of women in essentially divorce rights. And so you may say, divorce rights, it's such a narrow thing. Why are we focusing on divorce rights? I think when we think about the inequality between the sexes, where do we meet the patriarchy, if you will? I don't think that we meet it, everywhere. Sometimes we meet it and see it in the workplace. If you're walking down the streets in Israel, unless you're walking in Mea Sharim, you don't feel it so much. But you definitely see it in the home. We see it in two ways. The first of them is, of course, rising rates of domestic violence, which I think was a documented phenomenon around the world during Corona, or during COVID, sorry, as you call it. There were skyrocketing rates of domestic violence. And in Israel, it gave rise to a real movement of activists around protecting women from domestic violence, from intimate partner violence. Unfortunately, this government just declines to enact a law that would prevent husbands who have restraining orders against them from having an electronic bracelet put around their wrist, which would allow policemen to prevent women in real time, because women, I think more than half of the women who are killed in this country are actually killed by their intimate partners. So that's where the real threat is often from women, from the people, really unfortunately, that are closest to them. There's also, of course, the same when you think about issues like sexual violence as well, which is very much a threat for women across the spectrum. This is Jewish women, this is that, this is Arab women, this is Israeli women of all sectors, Haredi women as well. So for all women, this is a universal challenge. What happens when women gain the courage and decide they want to leave a violent relationship? Or let's just say they decide they're no longer in love anymore. What happens if their husband gets hit by a bus and is on life support? What happens if their husband just disappears? What happens if their husband gets ill with a mental illness? All of these things are things that can happen to any one of us. Any woman is a potential aguna, which is what we call women who are denied a Jewish divorce because her husband does not agree, does not give their permission. Currently under Israeli law, there's no civil marriage or divorce, it's only religious marriage and divorce. That, by the way, also is for Christian Muslim women. They also have to go to the Sharia courts or to the Christian law courts, but if you're Jewish, you have to go to the rabbinate, which is controlled really by the ultra-Orthodox, and the rabbinate is extremely unforgiving in its application of halakha. Any one of you who may have studied this issue will know that there are many halakhic solutions that are embedded within Jewish law, and they refuse to adopt them. And I'm talking even about things like halakhic prenups, which are widely accepted around the world, even by Orthodox rabbis and communities. So this is something that the government not only has entrapped women in a system that forces them to be reliant on their husband's permission for their freedom. It offers no solution. It doesn't matter. And we have a story of a woman who she opened the door one day, discovered that her husband was a pedophile, was abusing kids in the neighborhood. He became a convicted pedophile and was put in jail. And when she asked for a divorce, the rabbis were turned to him and said, well, what do you say? And he said, no, I want her to look after me. I'll let that sink in for you. I hope that I have 3 daughters, I also have 2 boys. I wouldn't want any of my daughters even to get married actually currently in Israel, because I believe that it's completely immoral for me to encourage her to step into a relationship that is going to entrap her and potentially her, and if not her, then her friends or potentially my granddaughters. And there are halakhic tools you can use to protect yourself, but according to the state of Israel, currently those tools are not recognized, so it's very much a gamble. I'm going to leave this for a moment because the issue of women's status in Israel is much broader than just the problem of divorce, marriage and divorce. and domestic violence. That's, of course, the extreme, even though 1 in 5 women do experience this phenomenon. Let's have a look at that, where women are in terms of economic stature. We've just heard about the startup nation and the huge success that we've seen in Israel, and thank God I've been privileged also to be a part of that. But women are very underrepresented there as well. They're a tiny proportion of entrepreneurs. And when we look at women's salaries, they lag 25 to 30% behind men's salaries. This is not explained by experience or going on maternity leave or any of that. This is pure and simple gender bias. And if you take into account the fact that men often take off a month a year to go on with the women, they're not discriminated against. This is really unconscionable. Of course, then we take another step back and we look at women's representation, which has taken a big hit in this current government. And I think this brings us to one of the big challenges facing the state of Israel from its inception. I don't know if you were aware, and I think it's a good opportunity to look at Israel in the perspective of 75 years. But the suffragette movement in Israel was one of the most advanced of its time. Already in 1917, women were gathering to demand a vote, and when they had the first National Assembly here in what was then Palestine, in 1918, women lobbied to get the vote, and it probably would have been the first place in the world that women would have been given the vote, except that they forgot to vote on it. Eventually, they did get the vote, and in 1920, 14 women were elected to the National Assembly. If you look at where we are now, there are only 9 women in the coalition, and 29 women in total in this current government. This is, I think, shameful. There's no other word for it. And the only reason why this is okay is because we have turned a blind eye to gender discrimination in ultra-Orthodox and religious sectors, and have allowed the ultra-Orthodox parties to continue to exclude women, even though there are ultra-Orthodox women and Haredi women demanding the right to be represented in those parties. And it's very interesting, actually, if I can go back to that historical moment in time when 14 women were elected to the National Assembly, the ultra-Orthodox got up and left in protest. So we're returning to the very same challenge. You cannot, unfortunately, extricate, I would say, the issue of women's status in Israel from the challenge of religion and state. In fact, I don't think you can extricate our economic situation from issues of religion and state, or of the particular challenge of how do we accommodate ultra-Orthodox communities within a supposedly liberal democracy. And I think that is actually the battle that we're seeing now in the streets of Israel. It's really a fight for the nature of the state of Israel and for a future which has a place for women in it and for our daughters. Whether they are serving in the army, whether they are engaging in volunteerism, like Melanie's daughter, whether they are studying in religious institutions, wherever they may go, women deserve to be treated as equal human beings, and we deserve freedom, we deserve representation, we deserve health, we deserve education, and we deserve equal pay for equal work. I'm sure that none of these things are shocking to you, and I will just leave you with one last statistic that perhaps maybe you can take home and talk about with your friends and family. Women and girls in Israel get less than 1% of philanthropic giving in Israel. Less than 1%. That means the organizations you support so generously in Israel need to be asked hard questions about what they're doing for women. It means that you should be looking at the way you give and support Israel through a gender lens and make sure you're asking the organizations that you support, what are you doing for women? And if they're not doing something significant for women, you need to tell them, thank you very much, but I'll go elsewhere. I urge you all, when you do your philanthropic investment, look at how you are helping to advance women and girls. because women and girls are the key to social mobility. In fact, the only influential factor in studies of children's social mobilities has been shown to be years of education of the mother. Investments in women are investments for a stable, good society, for peace, for welfare, and for education, and a stronger Israel. And when we invest in communities that are discriminatory, we get illiberal democracy and increased discrimination, increased violence, and a weaker economy. And I think that what we're seeing now is just proving the case. I really urge you all to look at it as a macro lesson in how we can make a better society. And if you're looking for a leader for change, think about women and girls. Thank you very much for your time. And I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kylie, and to all of our presenters. Thank you to Ido for managing without a single glitch to bring two outstanding speakers from Israel to ensure everybody can be both seen and heard. And at this time, too, we want to hear from you. This has been an interesting and at times challenging panel, but it is not exhaustive. There's so much more that we could say. So what I'd like to do is to invite those of you who have questions to make your way to the microphone located over here to my far left or behind this section and put it to our panelists. To review, we've heard from Rabbi Levi. I'd like to hear a little bit more about how you felt maybe when you learned news of Israel's establishment. We've heard from Joel on the subject of Israel politics, the 4 different stages. Melanie talked about Israelis and Palestinians and their relationship. And we've heard from Marcus, who's talked about the economic relationship between our country and the state of Israel. And we finally heard from Kylie. So in addition, should you have any questions, I would also like to invite you to share your feelings for Israel. Yesterday, I was very transparent in the email that was sent out from the synagogue's office. I am very passionate and very open about my love for Israel and how I regard it as nothing less than a miracle in our midst. If you have other such feelings, or there are concerns that are foremost in mind, please feel free to share them and we can talk about them as well. I'm going to kick off until such time as people make their way to the microphone with a question from Melanie. If Melanie can hear me, oh yeah, I better get my power cord too soon. I would like you to expand perhaps on your statement concerning insufficient grieving and sort of flesh that out for us. It's a very interesting concept, and I'm not certain it was completely understood.
Sure. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Rabbi, for the question. Can you hear me okay,
Yes.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Well, actually, the way that I understand that is it sort of emerged from hearing people speak about the inevitability of that. It's like, it's terrible, but this is the way that it's going to be. We're always going to be in war. A little bit like in the Passover Seder when we sing Vehisha Amda, like, this is what it's been. There's been all these people who've been against us, and then, before it was them, and now it's someone else, and this is sort of our fate. And it just struck me when I was reading that author that I quoted, Martin Prechtel, that he said that there's something about insufficient grieving that is related to that sense of the inevitability of war. And that if we fully let ourselves kind of feel the devastation of what's happened, then there's some way that we can't allow it
to sort of happen, and he links that grief with the sort of preciousness of life. But I think it's just in the last 5 years, having my own experience with also personal grief that helped connect me to more collective grief. I think that it's just really painful and undefended to actually really kind of like feel the depth of, of that loss. And even though it's painful, it's very painful to feel the inevitability of war, but in a funny kind of a way, in a tragic kind of a way, it can be a defense against actually what's an even deeper grief. I don't know, does that make it a bit clearer?
I think Melanie's marvellous.
Sandy for the next question. Thank you, Melanie.
Thank you, Gary. Having had the privilege of inviting each of you to speak today, I'm going to push it a bit harder. The elephant in the room, the current situation, the depth of passion about the current government, the depth of passion on both sides. But what I'd like to hear from maybe each of you for a moment, or some of you, in the area that you're involved in, how will it come back again? If you feel you are losing ground, how will you regain the ground again? I'm not sure who wants to start.
Would you like to?
Joel.
It's sort of that last phase that I was talking about. I guess the elephant in the room is you're talking about the judicial reforms and the subsequent outpouring of protests on the streets of many of the cities in Israel. This government is a unique government. It is the most right-wing government in Israel's history. And it has as its agenda, which has changed, well, it is on pause, I should say, but it still remains their agenda, a very radical overhaul of the current separation of powers in the construction of the Israeli political system. So in Australia, in most Western democratic systems, we have a separation of powers where each branch of government, namely the legislature, the executive and the judiciary, have clear roles, clear demarcation and clear separation. Now, for a number of reasons which are quite technical, which we can go into, but I will avoid doing so unless you ask further questions on it, Israel is has a unique structure where over the time and over certain periods, over the 75 years of its history, the lines between the branches has become a little bit fuzzy. What makes the fuzziness worse is the fact that Israel does not have a written constitution. In Australia, for instance, if one of the branches was to do something or overstep over its authority, there is a very clear document and set of instructions as to what happens in that case in Australia, and that is our constitution. Our constitution is an incredibly technical and well thought out document. It's not fuzzy, it's not fluffy, it's very procedural and very technical. However, what it does is it provides Australia with a very clear manual for what happens in constitutional crises. Unfortunately, in Israel does not have one. So what I will say is that I'm hopeful, and I know that at this stage it might seem a little bit idealistic to think this way, but I am still hopeful of an eventual compromise. I'll say this, and I'll be careful to say this. I think that the current suite of judicial measures go too far. I think that those in the current many in the current governing coalition agree with that. Many old heads inside Likud believe that it's an overstretch and don't support the scheme, hence the reason why the reforms are on hold, and also for other reasons. However, those that want reform have there are some arguments for said reform. Certainly not for the suite of measures that they're proposing, but for certain measures and certain things to change. So what I'm saying is that there's fertile ground for compromise. And my hope is that with the President's help, with Bougie Herzog's help, that the two sides will come to some type of compromise and agreement. It does look like that's far away. I don't want to say my hope, and I don't want it to appear as though that I'm unaware of what's happening on Israel's streets at the moment. It's very bad, it's very divisive, and it doesn't appear as though that a resolution is coming anytime soon. But my hope is that compromise is the eventual outcome.
I'd like to ask Melanie and Kylie if there are perspectives you'd like to share with respect to this winter of discontent on the streets of Israel. It was during their winter, no? Okay.
Can I answer? Or
yes, please.
Yes? Okay, so what I would say is that if you would have asked me a year ago what would be my fantasy, my wildest dream, I would have said hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets about women's rights. My dream came true. The question is now, how do we leverage that for good change and lasting, impactful change for Israel? And for me, the deep challenge is that whatever change, ideal that I may have, it has to accommodate a very diverse Israeli society. There is no doubt in my mind that there are sections of Israeli society that see women's rights as something very foreign and secular in nature. I myself belong to a community which is a modern Orthodox and which believes that there is no conflict between religion and women's rights, and I think you all belong to a community that also, it epitomizes this. So I don't believe that these mergers are impossible. The thing I keep asking people is, I wish I could talk to someone who lived through the Haskalah, through the Enlightenment, because they've already addressed these issues before in Jewish history. The modern day, the suffrage movement had to deal with these issues, and we have to deal with these issues. And if we're not able to make this case, then it's a real tragedy for the Jewish polity and for the Jewish world. On the other hand, if we are able to address these issues, then it's of lasting historical significance. I'd like to leave it on a hopeful note, which is we all take for granted, every single one of the streams of Judaism take for granted that a man only has one wife. Okay, one wife is not the halacha, it's not the Jewish law. At some point in history, in the 1600s, the morality of the day decreed that it was only acceptable for a man to have one wife. And that cultural pressure was enough to push the rabbinic leadership to make a takana Rabbeinu Gershon, which basically decreed that would also apply to Jewish men. Obviously, there was pushback at the time, but that has been a lasting change in in Jewish history and for Jewish women for many generations. I believe that this is a historic opportunity to do the same for women today. Thank you.
Mm.
Sorry, I don't hear you. I apologize.
That's right. One of the questions that arises out of this extreme right-wing government and some of the policies that have been put forward is how might such policies that are perceived as anti-democratic threaten the close relationship between Jews living outside of Israel who come from democratic countries like ours with the Jewish state and its citizens. I'm going to call upon Helen, who has a question for our panel.
Thank you. I've just come back from Israel. I spent 2 weeks there. I attended the conference for the World Union of Progressive Judaism, but as part of my stay, I was invited to the residence of the president, where he talked about the current situation. So I'm probably going over a little bit of what you have talked about, Joel, in particular. But my sense was that now it's secular Jews who are standing up. It's secular Jews who are saying not only will they not accept the judicial overhaul, they won't accept the raft of other bills that are going to discriminate particularly against women and against anyone of any stream of Judaism that is not orthodox. And I spoke to a person who had been involved very much in the government of Israel as a public servant, and his view was that Netanyahu will not survive this because those who he is in government with under this coalition, he will not be able to satisfy all their demands, and their demands will keep growing and growing. He also has a problem. He has his own corruption allegations problem. So on the other hand, he needs to do the judicial overhaul to save himself. So there are these two sides of the story, and he's between a rock and a hard place. And I'd just like to get your view of it and what you think will happen with the Israeli economy as a result of all of this, and those giving to Israel might start to hold back.
Thank you for the question.
Is that for Marcus or Joel or?
Probably both.
Sure. The observations are accurate in a way to say that, okay, so there are those that claim that Benjamin Netanyahu is self-interested in this judicial overhaul to protect himself from the current prosecution that he has with his fraud cases. The claim about the secular majority of Israel, the current secular majority of Israel, because it appears as though that on current demographic projections that will alter in the future, and I think that the composition of the current government is the start of that. It's an illustration of that changing demographic, which alters the spectrum that I was talking about in my initial remarks. So there's no doubt that the secular majority has been energized by this, and I think that's a good thing. The fact that you see so many people in the streets, from their own perspective, they're out there trying to protect their democracy, but from our perspective, they're illustrating that they live within a democracy. I think that that's a very powerful movement. And the fact that they've been doing it in such large numbers with relative lack of violence, I think is also a symbol of health as opposed to disease. What I will say is this. If the secular majority want to impact change, they should do it as they're currently doing now, because it's having an impact. They're currently in negotiations, and the current suite of judicial reforms is currently on hold. Okay, so they've been able to do that. But if ultimately they want to impact and they want to have change, they need to do it through the ballot box. And they have been grossly unsuccessful in doing so. And I think the best example of it was the last election. There was about 8% of the anti-Bibi vote. So we're not talking about left and right. We're sort of talking about it, but not really. We're talking about the non-Bibi camp versus the Bibi camp. So on the non-Bibi camp, Labor and Meret's decision to not merge and join as one faction in the election cost a huge percentage of votes on that side. We're talking about potentially four seats. So you're talking about moving the ledger from 66 to 62 or 61, where the arithmetic gets a little bit more dodgy for Netanyahu to form coalition. The same was for Ballot with the Arab parties of not joining in the suite. There was a large portion of votes. So in Israel, if you don't reach the 3.25% threshold in your vote for your party to get access into the Knesset, unlike in Australia where your votes will proportionally go to other parties as you give your preferences, it does not. If you don't reach the 3.2% threshold, your votes go, they disappear. They don't flow on to other parties. So that decision there of what was seen to be, I guess now has become the predominant level. I also think that there's a lot of modern Orthodox people on the streets of Israel as well that disagree. There's a lot of traditional Likud voters that disagree with the current suite of judicial overhaul. So again, it's complicated and complex, not to confuse people, but it's not as simple as a left-right divide. So to summarise, things aren't great at the moment, but there are positives in the way that people are behaving with the current atmospherics that are happening in Israel. So there is big issues that are on the line. However, I think that as a society, they've been doing a pretty decent job promoting what they believe are real Israel democratic ideals, and it appears as though, and the hope is that there will be some type of compromise that will, at least, I wouldn't say bring everyone in Israel together, but at least calm things down for the short term.
Thank you very much. I'm going to invite Marcus to respond, and Kylie too in Israel. But before I do so, I want to encourage you, if you don't have questions and you're not queuing up at the microphones, I want you to think about two other things. One, what do you believe to be the greatest achievement in the last 75 years of the Jewish state? And not only would I like you to share that, but I'd like you to think about an experience that you had in Israel that is one of those, it could only have happened in Israel stories. Okay, Marcus.
So just in terms of the economic impact, I think I'd agree with Joel and say I'd be optimistic about the compromise, because when you have former governors of the Reserve of Israel come out and say this is not good for the economy and creates a lot of uncertainty, not good for investment. And I think to a T, the high-tech industry, which they're not political, they're business people, and they have all different political views, all were against in its current form. So I would suggest that there would be some compromise where the high-tech community would be a bit more at ease. In terms of the current budget was just passed, I was speaking to somebody and he was very disappointed in terms of the cuts to the high-tech, and he was saying, Israel's very dependent on the global economy, and obviously high-tech generally around the globe is investment is reducing. So he said at that time we should be increasing, not reducing, so they weren't really encouraged by the priorities. But that's just like a budget issue. The big issue about the reforms, hopefully a compromise will be made.
Thank you very much. Kylie, I'd like to have you respond, and perhaps Melanie, you might also wish to add a comment as to how these protests about the court overhaul has affected the Palestinian community in Israel and what has been their response. Kylie?
I'm assuming you want Melanie to answer the question about Palestinians, so I'm just going to address a comment that was made about the need that those who are against the reforms need to work, or the left, I guess, or the centre left needs to work on creating a electoral win. I think what you saw over the last 5 Knessets, really, for people who are involved in social justice issues, it was impossible to do anything with the government because they either had just come in and were just starting, or they were preparing for the next round of elections. So we've had enormous instability for 5 rounds of elections. I think that to be honest, the electorate was exhausted. And then, Bibi got in as we saw. What you've seen is a huge revival of left and centre-left, and a real coalition that's been built between left and centre-left members. I think the only reason you actually have this government, which is a partnership between Bibi and the extreme right, is because all of the mainstream right won't sit with him. He's already alienated or backstabbed all of them. So I think you've got this real political alienation. You also have this I guess, a political idealization of one figure. All of which doesn't mean, I think many people believe, Bibi, if he had his way, he wouldn't do that. But I think putting all of that aside, and whether it's the man himself or political positions or why this kind of coalition is coming up, I think that you have to also address the reality is there is no social justice movement in history that I'm aware of that had an electoral majority. Not one. I don't think that you could have said that what's his name? I don't know, Mahatma Gandhi, did he have an electoral majority? I don't think you could have said that any of the main political movements had an electoral majority. And in fact, I think that social justice is always going to be a question of how do you create the right conditions and demand and protest, and the kind of things that we're seeing in the streets now in Israel are exactly about that. They're about saying, look, it doesn't matter whether you're left or right, it doesn't matter politically where you are on the spectrum. There are some things that are just not done, and some things that have to be respected if we are going to stay together as a coherent community, as a coherent society. And that is actually the question you're hearing. That is the debate that is happening. It's not about, right or left or political majorities. It is about what are the rules of the game here.
Thank you very much. Melanie, did the Palestinians respond as to the proposed changes to the judicial reform along with their left-leaning or center-left Israeli neighbors?
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to this, but I'll just say a few brief things. I once went to see, oh my goodness, I'm just blanking on his name, but he's the lawyer for the Prisoners Society of Palestinians. And he said that basically every time he's gone to the Supreme Court, he's never won. He doesn't expect to win, but he sees his role as a witness. So I'm kind of giving that. So something about these recent protests and all the sort of hype in Israel has been a bit hard for me. And actually, I haven't even brought myself to participate because after being involved so much with Palestinians and seeing the things that are happening on the ground every day and nothing really happening in terms of protest, and so something about it's like this bittersweet thing to see, yes, actually when people are upset about something, they can really take to the streets. So something's actually been quite challenging. Like I just haven't been able to sort of stomach in a way what's happening, and at the same time, different things are happening in different villages I've been involved with, home demolitions, and a school was just demolished in another community that we used to go to a lot that was, built with EU funds. My old organisation had just taken a group there, like 2 days before, and then the school got demolished, in a remote place, things like that. So things are still happening on the ground. I don't have too much to say about like Palestinian sort of responses to the current protests.
Thank you, Melanie. I'd like to turn now to Ian for a question.
Thank you. In fact, Melanie, you've probably touched on something that I want to ask maybe Joel or one of you in Israel, and that is the peace process. I don't know how long I've got to live, but I wonder whether we'll ever see peace in our time, as someone, Chamberlain, said once. Is that achievable, do you think? And if so, how or when and why?
Thank you, Ian. Who would like to field that? Rabbi?
Yeah, sure. Well, it helps if you're there. It helps if you can see what's going on. And you suddenly find out that the press releases of all sorts of organizations don't matter much in the light of building a railway line across the valley of Jezreel, ready to cross into Jordan. So somebody thinks there's going to be peace. And the same, there's an interchange, a road interchange in the Jordan Valley. And what are they building it for if they don't think there's going to be peace? So there are signs in Israel. Perhaps they're not part of the Knesset, but they're part of the organization that says that peace will come. And then, of course, there's the commercial relationship with the gas and Sinai. And there are all sorts of things which are going on. So there are sparks of hope, but I have no hope whatsoever with the present government.
You know, Rabbi was looking at various videos where the Hatikva is being sung on YouTube. It's a most inspiring exercise. And one of them was recently in Saudi Arabia,
Really?
where they were singing Hatikva. Who could have imagined? What did they say in 1964 in Saudi Arabia about relationships with Israel?
Yeah.
Right? No, no, and no.
No, no, no.
Okay. Thank you very much for
very
that.
good.
So has anybody anything to share? Israel's greatest achievement? An Only in Israel story? Have you had enough? Are you tired?
I think
shame.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to call upon Sandy to conclude our evening together. There will be refreshments afterwards for what is a Jewish event without coffee and cake, right? But before I do so, let me just remind you, should you wish to make a contribution to ARTSA, there's information here about it, and also the progressive appeal is always underway in some place here in Australia. And there you can promote and support those activities that work directly to advantage the Israel Movement for Progressive Judaism and the World Union for Progressive Judaism. Sandy.
Can I say,
Yes, please, of course. Sure.
I thought you wanted us to tell a story or to say something that we're proud of accomplishment.
Thank you. At least there's one person who's prepared to say. Yes.
What, sorry?
Can
I
please
say one thing?
Yes.
Because I would like the opportunity to say I'm incredibly proud of the state of Israel, and you should all be incredibly proud of the state of Israel. For all its faults, it's an incredible miracle that this ever occurred and that we ever had this opportunity. And I will just say that as the daughter of a professor of medical research, and I hope he is watching, one thing I have learned is no matter how terrible and awful the challenge, you never give up trying. And in fact, only good things, the good things that have happened in the world only come because people continue to make effort and don't give up. And I really appreciate every second of your time and your support, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you. Just one last word. 75 years ago, the Jewish people were powerless and landless. And look how far the state of Israel has come. Sandy.
Thank you, Rabbi. Friends, both here in the room tonight and the many of you who are watching online, thank you for joining this celebration of Israel at 75. For decades, it was the dream to have a state. And then in 1948, when the state was declared, the hard task began, and as you can see tonight, continues. Tonight, we have dipped into the complexity and the breadth of that task. For this, our first thanks must go to our presenters. Thank you to each of you for so willingly agreeing to be part of the evening and for the eloquence of your presentations. You have opened both our minds and our hearts. You've shone a light on the multi-layers of the country and the society and clarified why it never appears to be plain, smooth sailing in Israel. You've woven for us the complex tapestry of this democracy. Thank you, Rabbi Gary, for acting as the moderator so eloquently, as well as for your contribution. To honour each of you this evening, we're making a donation to ARTSA Australia, which is the not-for-profit that represents the views and values of Reformed Jewish Zionists who want to ensure that Israel lives in peace and security, and that it is the democratic and egalitarian society as was described in the Declaration of Independence. Thank you to our tech manager, Edo. We pushed it tonight, didn't we? To our office administration, to our facilities management, our security personnel, and to everyone whom I have failed to mention. In conclusion for this special evening, let's celebrate and join together in singing the Hatikva, the national anthem of Israel. And in doing so, we will honour those young people, Israel's citizen soldiers, who today and throughout the last 75 years have protected the land and the people of the state with honour and bravery. Thank you.
Nefesh Yehudi Homiya Ulefate Mizrach Kadima Ayin Letzion Sophia Lo Avda Tikvatenu Tikva בת שנות 2000 להיות המחושי בארצנו ארץ ציון ירושלים להיות המחושי בארצנו ארץ ציון Yerushalayim. Thank you, Edo. Thank you. Please feel free to join us in the Friedlander after you pick up your things, and we can continue our conversation and have a bit of a nosh. Thank you to Sandy Benjamin for helping to arrange